Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Nëïgsëndöïg show. My name is Nëïgsëndöïg, the namesake for this here podcast. For today, I decided to do a completely unscripted episode. Last week, part of it was scripted, and I had another part, I think another 2 parts that were filler and unscripted. I did have to edit some things out in the last episode because I said some things that I probably would not want to say in order that my OPSEC be broken. So that's why I did a lot of editing within the last week's episode. That said, though, I want to cover some of the software I personally use on a day-to-day basis, and anybody can use this software relatively easily. Why don't we get into that? And I can basically shut my mouth and talk about that. First off, I want to discuss the operating system in which I use. As many Cöcülës Nation viewers know, I started to use CachyOS as of late. Now, I've been using CachyOS for some time now, for about a few weeks, and I am already in love since I have fallen back into my Arch-based roots, which I knew I would eventually do so. And I have essentially been extremely satisfied for the content creation standpoint and from the hardcore gaming standpoint, especially playing competitive games like Call of Duty Black Ops 2, or Quaver, Xonotic, any of these games with active esports style communities. I mean, come on. Black Ops 2 is like one of the best esports I've ever heard of. Even though the CDL wasn't really a thing in 2013 during the Black Ops 2 season, but I digress. CachyOS, for those that are unaware, is an Arch-based distribution, really designed to be blazingly fast and super optimized, because there are a lot of optimizations under the hood that even Arch would be unable to do, unless of course one were to actually implement them manually, which you could do that if you use an Arch-based, or say, heck, even vanilla Arch. You could do the CachyOS fixes, but Cachy, if you just get the ISO for Cachy, everything is just done for you. Oh, and if you're wondering if Wayland works, for me, it actually does, because of the fact that I am not using a monitor that is DRM'd. As many of you would know, I'm getting on a tangent here, but I don't care at this point. I used an Aorus monitor, an FI27Q SA. Turns out, 4 years after I started using it, I found out that the monitor was nothing more than DRM'd to be Windows only, to where it seems to have messed up the EDID for the NVIDIA graphics drivers. An EDID, as I've explained before, is essentially a code of sorts, an ID, for the monitor and the DisplayPort cable when connected to a GPU, a video card. That was messed up when I first installed the 495 drivers. These are the proprietary drivers. And I was using Garude at the time. That was a long time ago. Now, with Cachy and this new monitor, an MSI Optics G274QPF, this is the one I'm currently using, I've had little to no issues with Wayland on Cachy on this monitor, but I decided against Wayland simply because it is not ready for prime time, and that's actually by design. A lot of the X11 guys are said to be trying to prevent the progress of Wayland. Some people are saying they would actually try to fix X11 and work on it some more before it was deprecated and all kinds of stuff. One person actually started to contribute to X11 again, from what I have last heard. But that said, the reason why I don't use Wayland is simply because it's just not ready for prime time, even though it is going to end up being the future, and Wayland will probably be the default on KDE and GNOME, even though I am using stuff like X11. And using X11 is actually going to be much better for me, despite some security risks that can easily be fixed if you are careful. But for Cashy, I tend to be more into the tinkering side of things. I am more of a tinkerer by nature. I mean, I'm just an Arch-based kind of guy nowadays. I used to be using the likes of Linux Mint, which was my long-time daily driver. And that is the operating system I would personally recommend you start with if you're getting down this path. There are a lot of tutorials, actually, on Mint alone on Cöcülës Nation, both regular Mint and the Debian edition, known as LMDE for short. Those are going to be in a playlist of tutorials on setting these up for gaming purposes. I would probably recommend the 21.3 tutorials, since those are going to be a little bit better, in my opinion, than the Mint 21 tutorial, which has 30 to 40,000 views on YouTube. I don't know why it became my most popular one, but I guess I had better cognitive activity back then than when I did the 21.3 tutorials, and this was before I upgraded to 22. Maybe I should probably do that for each of the sections of this episode. I can try that and see how that's going to go. I'll try it with another piece of software and see where this goes here. I'm just going to be improving it on the fly. Basically flying by the seat of my pants. Now I'm going to be getting into the software I use for content creation on the daily. There are going to be multiple pieces of software, and I'm going to explain a little bit about their features, at least as far as I'm aware as a user. I mean, I've been using these pieces of software for at least over a year, if not more. So there's that to consider. Now, I don't know much about the features. I can't really give you the exact features of many of these pieces of software, but I will try my best to explain what in the world they even are. I will be starting with, let's do OBS Studio. OBS Studio is the premier screen recorder software. It is free and open source, I believe, under the general public license, if I am not mistaken. And on top of that, it is probably one of the most well-known screen recorders out there, and it's completely free to use. All the features are right there in the binaries, in the source code. Everything is just given to you freely. And the project, I believe, runs off of donations and some sponsorships as well, since I have seen sponsorships on the OBS project website. Now, there are plugins that I am using for OBS. In my case, I'm using sometimes now the iOS OBS, is it the camera source? I think it's the camera source. There's a $17 app that's connected to this, but the plugin is completely free. All you have to do is pay like $17 and you can use your Apple devices as a face cam. And that's what I had done for over 4 years. Some of the older videos on Cöcülës Nation, my goodness, are they something else. The older videos on Cöcülës Nation have been known to use the microphone of an 8th generation iPad, but as I have explained in one video, I dropped it on a restroom floor before having to buy a 10th generation, and I've used a 10th generation. It's actually pretty darn good, definitely a little better than what I was using previously. That, and I'm also using a Samsung CO1U Pro. I digress though, because I'm going into a tangent, again, as I had predicted. OBS is the screen recorder I would use if you want to get into broadcasting and pre-recorded videos. But if you're only doing pre-recorded videos and you're doing a faceless channel, I'm sure there are other pieces of software you can use. I know for older computers, Fraps seems to be pretty good. And that's just from what I've heard. I'd have to look into some more stuff. If you want something Fraps-like on Linux, Simple Screen Recorder, I was considering using that as well. but it doesn't have the flexibility and the control of OBS, so I stuck with it. I also started experimenting with a game capture thing, basically a game capture plugin called OBS VK Capture, which will allow you to grab Vulkan captures, I believe, capturing Vulkan and OpenGL applications just by themselves in a specific window on Linux. Now, you will need EGL, which NVIDIA uses for their Wayland stuff. I personally don't use Wayland, but I don't have to deal with that since I've already been able to at least experiment with that. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the video coming out tomorrow on Cöcülës Nation, it's Thursdays at 3 p.m. now instead of 2 p.m. I wanted to do something different and try something out. I think I did use OBS VK Capture for it, but I am not entirely sure if I did. For the next couple of weeks, though, I will go ahead and test out the OBS VK Capture with a few games and see if that's going to work. Probably some newer games to the channel, but I am not entirely sure if the VK Capture is going to work. I mean, I'm just using Lutris and adding in the environment variable OBS_VK Capture 1 and then doing OBS-game capture so I can properly do game capture with the OBS VK Capture plugin, which, if you are on Arch, you'll be able to use it just fine because it's in the official repositories. I'm not using the AUR repository because that apparently causes a lot of problems. But if I get it, say, from the Cache repository, since I'm using Cache as I mentioned, then I should be okay. Now, that's just some of the features and the plugins for what I do with OBS. There's a lot of features that I cannot get into for this episode, would take a long time. And I want to take no more than 20 minutes of your day for listening to this podcast. I will go into Kdenlive, which is my video editor of choice. Now, I'm not the only one who used Kdenlive. I did in some of the early days, but I think since November of 2021, I have had an editor that I've been working with, which I may actually help him out with a big project in the future. I'm not entirely sure if he'll be actually committing to it or not. But the long and the short of it, my editor has been doing a lot of the editing for Cöcülës Nation for some amount of time now, longer than I have been. But I've picked back up on video editing. I've been doing the editing myself. Heck, I've even been doing the thumbnails in GIMP. I've done some of the voiceovers using Audacity. Now I'm using Ardor to do it. It's a bit of a mess, and I'm essentially constantly evolving on the software I use. I went on a tangent there, so I digress. Kdenlive is one of the most fully featured video editors. These are non-linear editors. This is the KDE non-linear editor. That's literally what it stands for, at least part of what it stands for. Kdenlive is free Libre open source software. It is licensed, I believe, under MIT or one of the GPL licenses, just like Krita, which is an art program, as an alternative to the likes of Clip Studio Paint. That just so happened to be under GPL. Now, there are other video editors that are also free and open source. Some people don't like Kdenlive, so they tend to use Olive instead, which is another piece of free and open source software, I think under GPL 3 or Apache 2, I forget which license off the top of my head. It's also got some features, but it is in an alpha state. Not great if you ask me personally. But you could also do something along the lines of DaVinci Resolve as a proprietary option. You could use some other open source options like, heck, even OpenShot, I think Shotcut. There are a lot of open source editors, but I think Kdenlive is the most fully fleshed out. Oh, and for those wondering, if you use Blender, you can also do video editing with Blender. I tried to learn it when I was having a high CPU usage problem, but I think I've since got that fixed by using proxy clips and 1080p with Kdenlive. So I should be alright with Kdenlive for the most part. Now I want to get into another piece of software I use, and that's the browser. Now, I have mentioned in some videos on Cöcülës Nation that I only use Firefox-based browsers, with the exception of Brave browser for a Chromium-based option, and I do a lot of hardening. Now, yes, some people are saying, Nëïgsëndöïg, this is gonna go ahead and expose your fingerprint. I'm always trying to fight my fingerprinting, you see. There are ways I am fighting fingerprinting. But if you want a Firefox-based browser that is not regular Firefox because of what Mozilla is doing to Firefox now, I would recommend taking a look at LibreWolf. It is a pre-hardened Firefox, though I just tend to harden it myself. And I would tend to use the Anonymous Planet method alongside the Michael Bazzell method of hardening a browser, especially when it comes to browser fingerprinting and canvas fingerprinting, which, my goodness, that is bad news. LibreWolf is one of the best browsers I could use for that, but it's not the only browser I'd use. I wouldn't recommend sticking to one browser. I use the Rob Braxman technique of compartmentalization. So I have one browser for my regular browsing. I have another for Google stuff. I use Zen browser for that, which is essentially the Vivaldi of Firefox-based browsers. I have the downloads browser for some certain downloads. That would be Florp, which is essentially it's a fork of Firefox. I think it's based upon Firefox ESR. But what they do is essentially not only harden it a bit, but they also do some, shall I say, crazy CSS to make it look like Google Chrome. You wouldn't even notice the difference if you were using Chrome or Firefox, specifically Florp. Kind of weird. Midori, I have been known to use that for Twitch in particular. I do use it for watching some certain content creators on Twitch. YouTube, I use Brave without an account, or with an account, I tend to use the Zen browser for that. And I've got some other browsers that I'm probably not going to want to mention here. That said, I had actually mentioned GIMP, or the GNU Image Manipulation Program, which is essentially your best free Libre open source software option for an alternative to Photoshop, unless you're not using Creative Cloud Photoshop. Now, it's an old version of Photoshop before they went cloud-based and basically started siphoning off data off of your machine if you were to use Windows. GIMP would be your best Libre option there. Though there are some other options like Inkscape, but that is designed for vector-based graphics. I don't know exactly the Adobe thing for Inkscape off the top of my head, but it's an alternative to that. Lightroom, well, if you use Lightroom, like my stepfather had been known to use Lightroom a little bit, you could use Darktable as an option. Apparently, Darktable is really good for dealing with raw photos and some other types of photos that I know Lightroom would be able to support. If ever I needed to use any audio recording software to do some voiceover work, as I did with a previous podcast that seemed to have flopped at this point called Computing Comparisons, it's on Cöcülës Nation, I was using Audacity at the time, and it's for Tenacity at first, but then I went over to an older version of Audacity that had none of the telemetry that a lot of people were afraid of. I have Tenacity now because, yeah, I do have some things that I can still use with an app image. I don't know if they actually have something in the AR for Tenacity, but I would always be willing to give that a look. But that said, I think it'd be pretty remiss of me to say that I would recommend using a DAW to do voiceover work, as I am right now with Ardor. You could use the likes of Reaper or Bitwig on Linux. Yes, you could do that. I think FL Studio with the ASIO plugin for Jack could also work on Wine, from what I've heard. I don't know what other DAWs could work on Linux with Wine. I know Z-Rhythm is one that's actually getting pretty good. I could probably do that from source and see how that goes for me. I could also do, weirdly enough, Qtractor. Qtractor apparently is good. Rose Garden is good as well, from what I've been hearing. I think I've been taking a little too long, and I think I'm just going to have the episode end here, so let's play the music. Good grief. I've been rambling on too long. Yeah, I think I need to do a script for the next few episodes and see how that's going to go. Speaking of that, each episode will be recorded and released every Wednesday afternoon at 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. You can catch this podcast on YouTube and yes, any Podcast 2.0 compliant player, whether it be Wavelake, AntennaPod, Fountain if you want to earn some Bitcoin as you listen to podcasts. Anything that supports Podcast 2.0, you'll find my podcast there because I host this podcast on Wavelake. But that being said, I am out of time for today's episode. Thank you, and good night.